Hello, my name is Edwin Kumasaru. I'm about to take up a Paul Mellon Centre postdoctoral fellowship on masculinity and apocalypticism in contemporary British art. And I'm also a co-convener of the Courtauld's Gender and Sexuality Research Group, along with Dr Rachel Warrener, the British Academy postdoctoral fellow here at the Courtauld. I'd love to welcome you all here this evening. I'm really excited about tonight's event. Please use the hashtag Black Masculinities to tweet about this evening's panel. And you can also tag us with @CourtauldGS or @CourtauldRes on Twitter. It would be great to hear your comments, thoughts, or questions as the event unfolds. So I have to say, it is a real honour to welcome our speakers, Dr Alice Correia and Dr Elizabeth Robles, whose highly original scholarship is profoundly important and essential for both art history and wider public discussions about race in Britain. Each will talk for approximately 15 minutes or so before we open up to a Q&A with both. I will introduce them properly before they give their papers. But first I wanted to say a brief note about the theme for today's seminar. As I said, it's really exciting for me to bring together tonight's speakers, as both have had an important influence on my own work and the scholarly field. Last summer, I took part in a workshop with Lizzie, and she presented a brilliant paper on contemporary art and the politics of hair, which also considered representations of Black masculinities, which was in part the inspiration for today's event. Alice taught me as an undergraduate student 10 years ago, introducing me to both feminist art history and Black British art studies. As someone who is mixed race, her classes had a powerful impact on how I made sense of my own identity. In preparation for tonight's event, I've returned to one of the texts Alice set readings for during my undergraduate studies, Kabina Mercer's hugely important and influential 1994 book, Welcome to the Jungle, New Positions in Black Cultural Studies. In it, he rightly chastises the academic field of masculinity studies for largely neglecting questions of race. Mercer writes profoundly, thoughtfully, and self-reflexively about Black masculinity in Britain and in the US, its tensions, contradictions, and complications. He considers how white supremacists constructed Black masculinity as a wild threat in need of taming to enforce slavery, as well as its violent and ongoing legacies in the present. Mercer writes that Black masculinity, quote, is also a key site of ideological representation upon which the nation's crises come to be dramatized, demonized, and dealt with. It is a pressure that British artist Keith Piper was also keenly aware of, and the subject of his 1991 exhibition, Step into the Arena, at Rochdale Art Gallery, which Alice will be speaking about this evening. Piper wrote in the exhibition catalogue of feeling, quote, being at one and the same time victim and victimizer, torn between opposing and contradictory forces. It comes from the sense of oneself as the site over which numerous macro-global contests of territory are being played out. Looking back at the 1990s from the perspective of today, our speakers this evening will consider how contemporary art, specifically, has been a site for registering and reimagining the politics and possibilities of Black masculinities in Britain. So before we begin, just a quick note on how the Q&A will work. You can either post your questions on Twitter by using the Black Masculinities hashtag, or share your questions in the Zoom chat box. If you'd like to share them via Zoom, please could you write the word question in capital letters at the start of your comment, your message. It just makes it much easier to find it when we're scrolling through. So without further ado, to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Alice Correia is an independent art historian. Her research examines late 20th century British art with a specific focus on artists of African, Caribbean, and South Asian heritage. She is currently research curator at Touchstones Rochdale, working on a major project examining the exhibition programme of the Rochdale Art Gallery during the 1980s. Is undertaking a Decolonising the Archive research residency at the University of the Arts Decolonising Arts Institute, examining the archival trace of South Asian women artists, and is chair of trustees of Third Text Journal and co-chair of the British Art Network's Black British Art Research Group. Her articles and reviews have appeared in Art History, British Art Studies, and NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Alice.
Thank you, Eddie, for that really marvellous introduction. It's really great to be here. I will share my screen. Right. Let's start. Okay. So, in his 1991 exhibition catalogue, Step into the Arena, Notes on Black Masculinity and the Contest of Territory, Keith Piper wrote an incisive essay identifying a series of stereotypical tropes that framed the representation of Black men during the 1980s. Let's see if we can go forward. At the start of his essay, Piper identified a formative moment in his own self-perception as a young Black man. Quote, "I was first confronted by this image as a coloured boy of 15 years, wrestling, as one does at that age, to orientate oneself and to map out one's social, political, cultural, and sexual presence. The image acted for me, as it must have done for a whole range of my peers and contemporaries, to aid in the crystallization of a whole body of unfocused but romantic assumptions around what it was to be young, Black, and male in the Britain of the 1970s. What was symbolically crystallized at that moment was that to aspire to become that Black of heroic defiance was where it was at." Piper went on to note that to be heroic was to be young, Black, male, and bitter, where to be bitter was productively misread to mean unpalatable from the point of view of the establishment. However, by the early 1980s, Piper was well aware of the dangers of being young, bitter, and Black. In Reactionary Suicide, Black Boys Keep Swinging, Piper developed the image of the lynched or crucified male body expressed in the colours of the British Union flag. The school tie suffocates and strangles the boy, reminiscent of the ways in which school rules seek to indoctrinate and create conforming bodies. The boy wears a Dennis the Menace t-shirt, and this reference to the character in a long-running British cartoon magazine, The Beano, is telling. Created in 1951, Dennis the Menace was more than just a troublemaker. He's been described as a disturbed maverick, a bully, a mean-minded vandal, with whom the authorities were in permanent and justified rage. However, by the 70s and early 80s, readers of the Beano were, and indeed continue today, to root for Dennis. He's one of us. But Piper's reference to this character proves to underline the fact that while such behaviour might be fondly tolerated when carried out by white children, black children will be punished for it. A photograph of a young black man holding a homemade petrol bomb during the so-called Handsworth riots of September 1985 was published on the front cover of British tabloid newspapers, including the Mirror and the Sun, as well as in broadsheet newspapers such as the Observer. The unnamed subject was vilified as typifying mindless violence, the mindless violent tendencies of Britain's black youth. The Sun reported, quote, "A black thug stalks a Birmingham street with hate in his eyes and a petrol bomb in his hand." This type of sensationalized reporting of the Handsworth uprising was a continuum of the ways in which blackness and criminality had historically been interwoven within British consciousness through the media. In 1974, Paul Hartman and Charles Husband, in their book Racism and the Mass Media, had already charted how the British print and broadcast media's construction of the black male as a source of fear and a site of discriminatory reporting had a long and deep history. And in the seminal 1978 publication, Policing the Crisis, Mugging, the State and Law and Order, Stuart Hall and others discussed the ways in which black male youth were scapegoated by the police and local and national media in order to explain criminal activity as a black problem, establishing a stereotype of the black male criminal in public consciousness, while simultaneously diverting attention away from the social inequalities and injustices faced by large numbers of black people. In a small drawing in one of his sketchbooks, Donald Rodney productively utilized the photograph of James Hazel, reproduced in the tabloids. However, rather than reproduce the photograph, in portrait of the artist taking a political initiative, Rodney presents the figure as a black silhouette. Emphatically present but devoid of his identifying features, the figure literally becomes an unidentified black man, both visible and invisible. Rodney's blacked out body erases the identifiable I and plays with the notion that this is a self-portrait. It also plays with the notion of the unidentified black threat. The shadow cast could be filled by any black male body. In 1991, Rodney reflected that, quote, "The attempt to produce a self-portrait when all black images have been appropriated and put under clearly defined areas of political and anthropological control has been a growing preoccupation." His solution regarding black self-portraiture was to approach the genre metaphorically, testing the limits of its parameters, and in so doing, challenging the framing space of representation. In making self-portraits such as this one, Self-Portrait, Black Men, Public Enemy, Eddie Chambers notes that Rodney was strenuously careful not to present himself within the work. So approaching self-portraiture with the understanding that his identity as a black man automatically positioned him within the purview of distinct, dehumanizing stereotypes, Rodney decided not to undertake a counter-position of creating positive black imagery as a strategy of contestation. Rather, in his portraits, Rodney self-consciously took on the guise of those stereotypes in order to highlight and critique the ways in which all black men were essentialized as homogeneous threat. Thus, in the project of decolonizing the visual representations of black people, one of the central strategies used by Rodney was to appropriate pre-existing imagery in order to highlight the ideological meaning and intent of media images that circulated in everyday life. Rodney had used the image of James Hazel in an earlier work titled Framed Youth. Here, Hazel is literally framed and captured. But like Piper's young, bitter and black image, Rodney's depiction of the petrol bomber is double-edged. Aware of the debates surrounding the role of violence in the processes of racial and political struggle, Rodney saw the petrol bomber as a type of avenging angel, and it's reminiscent of what Piper was talking about as the heroic black male youth. In this regard, Rodney's choice of imagery and his later presentation of the figure as a self-portrait suggests an empathy with the complaints and aims of the minority of young Black people engaged in direct action. And it's possible to discern an appreciation of Frantz Fanon's discourse on violent anti-colonial struggle. Writing in The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon argued that, quote, the development of violence among the colonized people will be proportionate to the violence exercised by the threatened colonial regime. Fighting fire with fire, the uprisings of the 1980s could be explained as proportionate responses to prolonged and sustained oppression. As such, Rodney does not sentimentalize or seek to downplay the militant intent of the Black urban warrior, but rather champions him as an expression of revolutionary consciousness. Again, to echo Piper, this is where it's at. To return to Piper, in his wide-ranging essay, Piper reflected on the possibility of Black men, the possibility that Black men are able to shape their own representation. For Piper, the Black male body was a site or arena on or within which contested and conflicted forces meet and were played out. He observed that the heterosexual Black male inhabits a position of both victim and victimizer, torn between opposing and contradictory forces. Using the examples of boxers Frank Bruno and Mike Tyson, he suggests that the roles Black men are permitted to play within Western society were narrow and heavily policed. And he suggested that central to understanding contemporaneous perceptions of Black men and Black masculinity, and particularly Black sportsmen, was an understanding of the commodification of the Black male body through history. Piper acknowledged that the commodification of the Black male body under the controlling gaze of dominant white socioeconomic imperialism was a recurring theme in his work, seen initially in this pencil drawing Body Type 2 from 1982, and then again in the 1983 mixed media work, The Body Politic. Both works contain the same text written from the perspective of the Black male protagonist. Quote, to you, I was always just a body, a fine physique. I was your best fantasy and your worst fear. Everything to you, but human. Piper continued to explore the Black male body as commodified physical specimen in his works at the turn of the decade, in his show at Rochdale and also in London. And for many artists, the 1988 Olympics was a critical pinch point. Here was an arena in which the Black male body excelled and could be marveled at, and, as Piper noted, be praised as the nation's finest. This is a video work and it's available online on Keith's personal webpage. So Piper's video clearly explains that the public is able to celebrate the genius of the sporting body, but struggles with the idea that this genius is a result of hard work, dedication, training, and practice. The Black athlete may be celebrated, but his physique is understood as God-given and natural. It is genetically given. It is a fact of his biology. The image of the disgraced runner, Ben Johnson, who won the 1988 gold medal, the 100 meters gold medal at the Olympics, features in several of Piper's works from this time. However, for Piper, Johnson's crime, he was stripped from he was stripped of his Olympic gold medal because he was found guilty of taking anabolic steroids, banned steroids. But for Piper, Johnson's crime wasn't so much that he took the steroids, but rather he confounded the mythology that sees Black sporting prowess as inbuilt and genetic. He betrayed that lie by saying that he had to take enhanced supplements. The 1988 Olympics also brought Linford Christie, the British athlete Linford Christie, to broad public attention. In the wake of Ben Johnson's suspension, Christie was upgraded from a bronze medal to a silver. Here, it would seem, was a true British hero. But as Ben Carrington has outlined, Christie was a problem for the British media because he publicly mentioned the fact of racism. And in so doing, he disrupted the normative codes within which Black athletes were supposed to work. According to Carrington, Christie's refusal to play along with the role of a grateful and loyal Black subject meant that he was subjected to a racialized discourse of sexualization that sought to undermine his achievements by reducing him to discussions about the size of his genitalia. And the phrase Linford Christie's lunchbox, Linford's lunchbox are still active search terms. There were multiple newspaper reports in sort of around 1988 about 10 ways to pack your lunchbox like Linford, for example. All of these, that discourse around Linford Christie recalls Frantz Fanon and what he wrote in Black Skin, White Mask, where the Black man is effectively reduced to his phallus. Quote, "One is no longer aware of the Negro, but only of a penis. The Negro is eclipsed. He is turned into a penis. He is a penis." Now, I mentioned these hypersexualized stereotypes of Linford Christie as, and the way that Christie is rejecting those stereotypes, because at the same time, Lenny Henry, the Black British comic, had a mainstream BBC One TV show that was broad family viewing. And one of his most popular characters was Theophilus P. Wildebeest, a highly sexualized lounge singer in the mold of Barry White. Wildebeest, for all his sexual flair, however, was inept and the source of much comedy. But you can see his costume is a riff on those sort of 1970s blaxploitation Parliament-esque costumes. The character was initiated in the late 1980s, but was still going strong in 1997. And at that time also found a counterpart to in the character Chef in South Park, who quite bizarrely was voiced by Isaac Hayes. Now, I mentioned this move into the 1990s and the continued presence of these Black stereotypes of the highly hypersexualized Black man in order to contextualize Chris Ofili's Captain Shit series. Captain Shit and the Legend of the Black Stars of 1996 was included in Ofili's major solo touring show of 1998 at the Serpentine and Southampton Art Gallery. And the Adoration of Captain Shit and the Legend of the Black All-Stars Part 2 was included in Ofili's Turner Prize show of 1998. And both paintings were met with a mixed critical reaction. For many, it was entirely unclear whether Captain Shit should be regarded as an empowered Black superhero in the mold of Shaft or Luke Cage, or as a kitsch, effeminate caricature of Black masculinity. With his flaming red and yellow costume, hairy chest and medallion, the initials CS dotted on his elephant dung belt buckle, Captain Shit is an auspicious figure for his adoring fans, but an ambivalent one for those who are unsure whether to view him in terms of subversive mimicry or racist stereotype. So when I first wrote about these works, now many years ago, I argued that in harnessing a strategy of mimicry, the carnivalesque body of Captain Shit may be regarded as a transgressive figure who subverts stereotypes of the hypersexual Black heterosexual male. Here, the carnival clown, the grotesque, the hyper-caricature of Captain Shit as an image of transgression captures a world of topsy-turvy, of heteroglottic exuberance, of ceaseless overrunning and excess, where all is mixed and hybrid and totally in keeping with the new Labour multiculturalism. I've previously argued that when using the vocabulary of blaxploitation, hip hop, and Black popular culture in the context of high cultural production, Ofili continues a tradition of hierarchy inversion as a ritual strategy on the part of subordinate groups, where in the carnivalesque body presented to us in the Captain Shit series, we're offered an alternative vocabulary with which to discuss the politics of Black representation. Is it possible that Captain Shit is an embodiment of Homi Bhabha's mimic man who displaces the gaze of his oppressors through a mimicry of their vocabulary, disrupting the controlling gaze? Perhaps we can hear echoes of Bhabha's mimicry when Robert Stamm says, quote, "The cheerful vulgarity of the powerless is used as a weapon against the pretense and hypocrisy of the powerful." However, Rashid Areen in particular put his head above the parapet to criticize Ofili and these works. Areen criticized Ofili for acting like a juvenile and for clowning and buffooning and to playing up to these racist stereotypes. Areen argued that Ofili exacerbated the perception of his African roots for an audience keen on exotic authenticity, whereby his use of elephant dung and dot paintings became proof of his so-called native authenticity. For Areen and others, these signs of Africanness and Blackness were also signs of selling out, of providing a VIP pass to commercial success by way of playing into the racist ideologies of a dominant white society. In this reading, Ofili is a court jester playing to the white audiences of the white establishment, where his interest in hip hop and Muhammad Ali becomes a checklist of Blackness that conforms to white stereotypes. Coco Fusco has reported that many at the time were concerned and outraged that Ofili was simply, quote, giving whites the kind of nasty, depraved images of Blacks they loved to see. And I think in some respects, Ofili didn't refute that argument when he said, quote, "It's what people really want from Black artists. We're the voodoo king, the voodoo queen, the witch doctor, the drug dealer, the magician deletere, the exotic, the decorative. I'm giving them all of that, but it's packaged slightly differently." So when I first started thinking about these works, I was fairly sure that Ofili was acting as a trickster, using double consciousness productively to contest Black stereotypes. And in preparing for today's talk, I'm not so sure. So perhaps we can talk about that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. That was really fantastic. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that. Such brilliant and timely, urgent and important research. I really appreciate it. I'm going to introduce our second speaker now, and after that we'll have a kind of group discussion and Q&A. I'm enjoying the comments people are posting in the chat. It's really interesting to hear from you. Please do keep that coming, and if you have any questions as we're going along, please do post them and we'll come back to them in the discussion afterwards. So to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Robles is a researcher and lecturer in contemporary art in the History of Art department at the University of Bristol. She's particularly interested in the formation of ideas around Black art across the 20th century and is currently a British Academy postdoctoral fellow working on a project entitled Making Waves, Black Artists and Black Art in Britain from 1962 to 1982. So yeah, if you'd like to begin.
Thanks, Eddie, for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint up and hopefully you can see and hear everything okay. Right, so thank you. Thanks to Eddie and Rachel for your kind invitation to contribute today, and thanks to Alice for sharing your scholarship with us. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion to be had a bit later on. So this evening, I'd like to focus on a single work by London-based artist Faisal Abdul Allah, namely his 1993 series, I Want to Kill Uncle Sam Because He Ain't My Motherfucking Uncle, to draw out some key themes, some of which Alice has already discussed really insightfully in her paper, around stereotypes of Black masculinity, space and place, and performance and pose. I'm just gonna move us ahead. Yeah. So for this work, Abdul Allah collaborated with the North London-based rap group, the Scientists of Sound. And I think, you can see them here, whose members were photographed individually holding prop weapons, guns, knives, a club, and gesturing out of the frame to the viewer. Each image bears the name of the member it depicts: Raham, Khalil, Hassan, Sadiq, or Akil. In the very first incarnation of the work, as a part of Abdul Allah's degree show at the RCA in London in 1993, the images were installed on the stark white peripheral walls of a small room. At the center of the room lay a life-sized coffin, not unlike the sculpture that would later form part of the Heads of State installation from 1997, which you can see here on your screen. As you can see, the coffin was printed with a draped flag bearing the face of Lord Kitchener, the British Field Marshal and Secretary of State during Secretary of State for War during the First World War. Kitchener's image was used in a mass armed forces recruitment campaign during the Great War, Britain's Your Country Needs You, producing one of the most enduring icons of that era. And within an American context, giving rise to Uncle Sam. Though the work has been shown in several other formations since its debut, it's this configuration at the RCA show that I'd like to talk a little bit more about today. Like Fuck the Police, Abdul Allah's 1991 work, shown here, for which the artist worked around similar themes using the same medium, I Want to Kill Uncle Sam has been criticized for perpetuating the stereotypes of violent young Black men, which Alice already talked about a bit today. However, here I will argue that the artist's approach is more nuanced than this. I'll argue that he plays with what Stuart Hall calls the 1980s fashion for positive imagery of Blackness, and more specifically, Black masculinity, to reflect the contemporary move towards a constructed image. In effect, a new kind of cultural politics of representation, as the figures confront both the viewer and the limits of their own pictorial space. The fixed image of the stereotype is reshaped and eroded through performance and pose. The intersections of space, place, representation, and stereotype, and of course, representation of stereotype, are essential to the work. The baggy trousers, work boots, and hoodies worn by the musicians are heavily indebted to the style made popular by the early 1990s transatlantic hip hop scene. They embody the, quote, project or ghetto myths of American gangster rap, the slackness culture of Kingston, and the rude boys of London. The title of the work is taken directly from Ice Cube's I Want to Kill Sam, which is a track on his second studio album, Death Certificate. You can see that album here. Released in '91. and emphasizes Abdul Allah's interest in the early 1990s rap scene. Like earlier recordings, such as Ice Cube's collaboration with the Lynch Mob, titled America's Most Wanted, and Public Enemy's Fear of the Black Planet, I Want to Kill Sam, and I've just popped some lyrics up because when I've given this paper or versions of this in the past, we've had time to sort of watch the music video, but I think for our purposes, this might just be helpful to illustrate some of the themes. I Want to Kill Sam confronts the historical violence visited upon Black people and culture, from that implicit in the transatlantic slave trade to the appropriation of jazz and the urban crack epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, and advocates for radical and often violent resistance to the continued subjugation and criminalization of Black bodies. However, one can argue that it's not necessarily the iconography of early 1990s gangsters or rude boys that lies at the heart of Abdul Allah's work. Rather, it's the conflation of style and carefully constructed self-representation, with the objectification of young Black men as criminals, deviants, or threats, a slippage with deep historical roots that continues to yield tragic outcomes that seems to come under fire here. And also, it's worth noting an American artist, David Hammond's work from the same year, In the Hood. Indeed, within a British context, Abdul Allah's portraits are inscribed onto a history of conflating youth, class, race, and criminality that, beginning in the mid-19th century, saw social explorers and do-gooders in the lexicon of that time, unknown continents, the jungles and the Africas of Manchester and the slums of East London. As Stuart Hall writes, Abdul Allah's figures freeze, suspended in some imaginary no man's land between North London, West Kingston, and the South Bronx. They occupy a simulated liminal danger zone between the shootout and the fashion shoot. The stark white backdrop against which the figures pose emphasizes this liminality by forcing them onto the edges of the frame and into the viewer's space. Raham's gun points directly at the viewer. Is he posing for a photographer, or is he threatening violence? The hood of his baggy sweatshirt is pulled down over his eyes, and the remainder of his face is obscured by the gun clenched in his closed fist. He wears a ring bearing the star and crescent of Islam. He is doubly othered and doubly threatening. This is not the glittering presence of what Paul Gilroy calls the emergent cast of Black celebrities, stars, and positive icons, whose representation increasingly defined images of Black life in late 20th century Britain, replacing images of day-to-day life that were the norm before the rioting and civil unrest of the 1980s. As Mark Seeley notes, quote, "To those who fear Black people, Raham is a worst case scenario." The stereotype of the violent Black man is here itself a descendant of the historical brutal Black book, and a product of the precarious placement of Black masculinity as a site upon which the nation's crisis comes to be dramatized, demonized, and dealt with. In this work, Abdul Allah seems to be playing on the traces of the Black brute, physically big, strong, no good, violent, renegades on rampage, and full of Black revenge. That's a quotation from Donald Bogle's discussion of this stereotype. And interestingly, and asked maybe this is something that we can talk about, there's sort of another version of the Black buck that I think relates, to the sort of sexuality that you talked about when in the context of the Ofili. Anyway, yes, so the Black brute that are found in contemporary images of Black youth. As Homi Bhabha notes, though, the stereotype is not merely a caricature, but an idea or image, a form of, I've really mixed myself up. It's not merely a caricature or an idea, an image, but a form of knowledge and identification that vacillates between what is always in place, already known, and something that must be anxiously repeated. These are pictures of Black masculinity that are meant to unsettle. They are urban nightmares, but ultimately they do not subvert the status quo. According to Baba, though, it is the repetition of the fixed image, the stereotype, that betrays its instability. Indeed, it's in the repetition of Abdul Allah's figures that the stereotype begins to unravel. Despite the different clothing, props and stances of the figures, it is the stereotype that is repeated. One violent, angry Black man, indistinguishable from the next. However, as soon as this image is fixed, it begins to fall apart. Each figure has a name. There is no anonymity here. Furthermore, the images represent a careful collaboration between each individual artist and Abdul Allah, the photographer. The musicians chose and wore their own clothing for the shoot and selected the props that they would like to pose with. They were given final say over which image was used to represent them. Right? As Hall observes, the line between who these boys are, what they aspire to be, and how they represent themselves and are represented, a complicated shifting boundary at the best of times, has diminished almost to vanishing point. Abdul Allah does not disrupt the fixed image merely by replacing negative images with positive ones in the celebratory tradition around Gilroy's cast of Black celebrities. Rather, he follows Hall's assertion that the stereotype can only be dismantled by an alternate form of representation that better approximates the complexity of the real relations it seeks to explore and contest. It is perhaps a relationship between themselves and with the viewer negotiated through space that dismantles the fixed image here. As Seeley observes, for a brief moment, Raham allows us to feel threatening. Then he displaces the danger by allowing us to get a sense of what it feels like to be under threat, a psychological state not unfamiliar to many young Black men. Raham plays on a diverse range of anxieties, ultimately asking, who is frightened of whom? Indeed, in the face of the racially motivated murders of Stephen Lawrence, Kelso Cochran, David Oluwole, Gurdeep Singh Jagar, Altaf Ali, Roland Adams, and on, in an only short list of those that occurred in or before 1993, again when this work was made, and the ever-growing number of young Black men subjected to unjust and brutal police tactics in both the UK and the US, perhaps the assumed white viewer are not the ones who should be or indeed are afraid. It is this dynamic that is at the core of the recording from which Abdul Allah took the name of the work, and it is this history occluded by the mainstream narrative of the, quote, urban nightmare that is allowed to surface here and implores the viewer to consider again who is frightened of whom. Whilst the front-on poses of the figures seem to initiate a standoff between them and the viewer, when considered in that formation that I discussed before in the RCA show of 93, where they're sort of situated around the coffin, a third possible relationship is opened up in the spaces between the figures. On the walls of an enclosed room, the guns, knives, and bats threaten not only the viewer, but also the figures displayed opposite each other. For Ice Cube, who discussed the role of gangster culture in conversation with Bell Hooks, the relationships between Black subjects and those between Black subjects and white society are inextricably linked. I think violence has become a way of life, he says, and I think Black people have always carried guns to protect ourselves from white men. And I think white men themselves can't integrate, but they're really going to pump this self-hate so that the guns will never be pointed up, but will always point towards each other. Indeed, as the viewer moves around the space, the gun pointed by Raham rather the guns pointed by Raham and Hassan, we see here on the far left, remain fixed on the figures displayed opposite. Even in the absence of the viewer, the space between the figures remains fraught. The coffin in the middle of the room suggests a casualty, but who and how and why? In this way, Abdu Allah plays with and maybe celebrates the possibilities and implications of Black masculine self-performance, was complicating the stereotypes of the young, violent Black man that continues to flourish across popular culture, often with tragic outcomes. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. That was such an excellent and fantastic paper. I really, really enjoyed hearing you speak. I'm so thrilled that I could have both you and Alice together here this evening, because your research speaks to each other in such fascinating and important ways. And it was really a real honor to hear you both talk about that subject. You'll know about this a lot more than I would, but it struck me reading Kabir Murta in 1994 when he says, very, very little masculinity studies deals with race, at least in the context of Britain. It strikes me that actually that's to a large extent still the case. Although obviously both of you have done, really important work on the subject. We have about 15 minutes. We have some questions. I'd also really love to hear the two of you kind of speak to each other. And if you have any questions for each other, there's a few things I'd like to, maybe suggest as a starting point. One of the things I loved at the end of your paper, Alice, was talking about revisiting and returning to a work years later. Which is something Kabir Murta also does in that book. And I find that a really fascinating relationship as an art historian to an object. I wondered if you could say something about how you've found that process of revising and returning to it. And perhaps if you could also say something, and this is something I'd love to hear from Lizzie too, something about what it means to think about and approach the 1990s from today's perspective, and how that looking back might have felt different at different times and moments.
Shall I go first then? My work on Chris Ofili really started when I was doing my MA at the University of Sussex. And in preparation for today, I dug out my thesis and was horrified to realise that I wrote it in 2001. Now, in rereading what I wrote then, what struck me was my youthful enthusiasm for this sort of post-racial multicultural Britain that I had grown up in as a teenager. The first election that I ever voted in was the 1997 general election, which brought in New Labour. And so I was definitely part of that generation that had grown up in the 80s and had been aware of things happening in Brixton. But my experience of Black masculinity, if you like, was Lenny Henry and Linford Christie and great TV personalities, and growing up in the 90s it was about multiculturalism and getting along in this great melting pot, particularly in London at that time. And I also think rereading it, I had a youthful naive optimism that the McPherson report would actually change things. And that's what I get rereading my interpretation of Ofili's work then, and rereading it now in light of what's happened over the past 20 years, but also in terms of my own research into, or deeper research into, artists working in the 80s, and why artists in the 80s may have been so horrified at what Ofili was creating, has made me rethink. And I think I have a lot more sympathy with some of the criticisms that were published in sort of 1988, 99 about Ofili.
That's super interesting. Lizzie, is there anything you'd like to say about looking back and how you feel about that as a decade, I guess?
Yeah, so I think sort of thinking like Alice a little bit, sort of self-reflexively, a few things, like not least that I didn't grow up in this country. I'm American by birth. And yes, so the 1990s for me, and reflecting on what, in the US in the 90s, there's this mass, a big moral panic in essence around hip hop, around what it signified, and arguably what it, this idea that it maybe signified the dominance of a sort of identifiably Black cultural form, sort of in becoming pop music, anyway, but thinking about the ways in which that transformed in different ways and was articulated in different ways in this country, I think was for me very interesting, because it was a little bit, like Alice said, reflecting on this place and time that I grew up in, but also, it's sort of strange and familiar, because it, I didn't know who Lenny Henry was before I moved here. And so thinking about that sort of transatlantic thing that I think Faisal Abdullah is tapping into so heavily, but obviously articulating it through a British lens and trying to not shift the scholarship to become Americocentric, because I think that's something that Paul Gilroy talks about a lot. That is a real problem when I think when it comes to talking about Black art, or Black art, whatever that might be, and artists who are Black.
There's a question about stereotypes from the audience, and I just want to say I really loved how you, the kind of such a thoughtful and complex way you thought through, and in fact it resonated and it came up in both your papers in a really interesting way, the idea of the stereotype or stereotypes, and particularly the tension between, like I was very struck by the questions of self-portraiture and the fixing or the unfixing, but how some of those conceptual systems also, once they were placed under particular kinds of pressure, they began fraying, I think, in really interesting ways as well. The question from the audience is about, and I guess this is perhaps also true of Chris Ofili in ways that Alice spoke about in clearly like, very complex in his work, but the extent to which, artists or musicians are kind of parodying and sending up stereotypes, and I guess the kind of when they get reappropriated back into cultural discourses and destabilized further. I suppose, is there anything that either of you would respond to about?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just rereading that one in the question in the chat, because I think it was a very rich question. Yeah, I mean, I think that, and again, maybe this is a part of that looking back thing, that in the 90s or 1993, I think there was something, again, there was this big moral panic about what hip hop represented, about what sort of gangster rap specifically represented. And so I think looking at some of those stereotypes constructed or sort of given voice then, that, that image given voice then, that has, it's inevitably, sort of become, it worked its way into pop culture, didn't it? And now, just thinking about sort of style, you could go into sort of any mall in middle America and find all of those clothes. You could dress up yourself in that way. Yes, I think inevitably it's something that's been sent up and reappropriated and sort of sidelined and contested in really interesting ways. You have this sort of rise of Black dandyism, people like Andre 3000, and the rise of Afrofuturism. That you can think about as sort of rejections of those narrow forms of masculinity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Actually, we had just talking about dandyism. I thought, Alice, you spoke really wonderfully about, the politics of Black male sexuality. We had a kind of comment question at the beginning about heterosexuality, Black heterosexuality. Is there anything about the works, the objects that you've been looking at that might reveal or shed light on the politics of sexuality around?
Yeah. Well, in his essay for the Rochdale show, Keith Piper is pains to specify that the Black masculinity that he is talking about is heterosexual. And he's very aware throughout the text that the stereotypes that he is engaging with are heterosexual stereotypes. And he interestingly sort of discusses the beginnings of what we now call the British Black Arts movement in terms of a machismo that had its basis in a kind of Black Power, Nation of Islam narrative around Black heterosexual strength. And he recognizes the fact that in reality, he and others were able to undertake the type of work that they were doing because counter to the types of work where he and Eddie Chambers and Keith Piper are engaging with a specific Black heterosexual male body. Counter to that, there are Black women artists who are engaging in diverse narratives of femininity in terms of sexuality, age, class, what have you. And he very specifically recognizes that the work that he does could only take place within or could only flourish within an environment that had space for all of those diverse narratives and interpretations. And he recognizes that what is missing is the homosexual Black voice. And yeah, I guess, yeah, there are other artists who are perhaps engaging with that now, and certainly Kobina Mercer and David A. Bailey's essay about Little Richard and Black sexuality was a really important essay published in the mid-90s, I think, about homosexual representation. So yeah, so Keith Piper is definitely aware of it, but he says openly at the start of that text, I'm speaking from a Black male heterosexual position. So yeah.
Fantastic. That's super interesting. I mean, it sounds like such an important and profound exhibition. Actually, it's really wonderful to hear more about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he talks about Mike Tyson, the contrast between Mike Tyson and Frank Bruno, these boxers, Mike Tyson is kind of the embodiment of, or is positioned rather as the embodiment of the kind of macho beast, and Frank Bruno is positioned as this kind of softly spoken family man who is conformist outside of the ring. So the sort of soft, hard, masculine, feminine kind of binary is present there, but I think this needs to be teased out a bit more by more scholarship.
I was just thinking, I think Patrine Archer-Straw has written about that as well, hasn't she? Specifically about Mike Tyson and boxers.
I think so.
We are almost out of time, but there's one last question which I think is fantastic, and super interesting. So I'd love to ask it anyway. It's from Theo Gordon. Hi, Theo. He says, what do you make, he says, hi, Alice, what do you make of Ofili's invocation of shit and the anal in the context of hetero and homosexuality?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know. I'll have to think some more. I have to think carefully about that. But what I think there's, what do I think? I think there's a lot to be said about why Chris Ofili is using elephant dung and calling it shit. And yeah, I'll need to think about that one, if that's okay.
Okay, well, we're out of time. I mean, both of you are absolutely fantastic. It's such, brilliantly original, urgent, and important research, and really fascinating papers. It's really lovely to see like all of the comments and enthusiasm from our audience here this evening. I think this is still a kind of an area of scholarship that deserves a lot more work and attention, and I'm profoundly grateful to have both of you, offer your analysis and insights. So obviously we'd normally have a round of applause. In the absence of that, please could everyone, leave your comments and, show your appreciation for our speakers here this evening. But anyway, I'd love to say thank you because that was fantastic and you were brilliant. So.
Thank you for inviting us. And
thank you, Eddie. It's been really, really interesting conversations and talk.
Anyway, have a wonderful evening. And if anyone's got extra questions, I'm sure about like references to particular books, I'm sure they can drop our speakers an email or something like that. But yeah, thank you so much.